solidarity with Julian Assange. Today's event is particularly special because we commemorate the Tolpuddle martyrs, and we're going to talk about some of the big issues around both Julian Assange's case and that of the Tolpuddle martyrs, including things like smearing, the use of establishment power to stamp down on workers, the use of lawfare. And I'm very, very pleased and delighted to welcome to the panel economic historian Helen Mercer, Dr. Helen Mercer, um, barrister Geoffrey Robertson, QC, who's very well known, and former MP and staunch Julian supporter who's been with us in this struggle right from the start, Chris Williamson. Welcome, Chris, Geoffrey, and Helen. Just for those who've never been to a Free the Truth event before, the way this event will work is that we'll have a little bit of a discussion with the speakers at the start. Thereafter, we'll go into question and answers. And if you have any questions, please use the Q&A tab within Zoom, or questions. If you want to send it via the internet, we are broadcasting live via Consortium News and also via Action for Assange. So they will pick up the questions and pass them on to me as we go through. For those of you who've never heard of Julian Assange and for whom this is the first event, and you all may know about the Tolpuddle martyrs, of course, and you may be coming at it from the trade union side. Just to let you know what's happening, Julian is the founder of WikiLeaks, which is an organization that allowed whistleblowers to let the rest of the world know what's really going on. And part of what was special about what Julian did was this ability to have a virtual, almost like a Dropbox, where you could put vast amounts of data in, which meant that, and this is what Patrick Coburn once explained at a meeting, a lot of people on the ground in Iraq, in Afghanistan, where wars were taking place, knew that these war crimes were taking place. But what they didn't have was complete evidentiary proof to be able to, especially the journalists who were on the front line, to be able to prove what was going on. And through the leaks, through the courage of people like Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, and of course others like John Kiriakou, and so many other whistleblowers, because WikiLeaks' work spans, things like TTIP. It spans a lot of work around corruption in Africa. It spans information about political manipulations in America. It also spans, of course, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And this information was not made visible to the world without a certain amount of intermediation by journalists. And much of this intermediation in the past had been, there were, of course, a number of investigative journalists who were very courageous, people like John Pilger, who brought the truth to the world, but there were also others who were taken in by the narrative provided by the state, or in fact, indeed, colluded with the state to prevent us from knowing what's really going on. And WikiLeaks' role in allowing us to see the truth about what was going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, the horrors of children killed, women raped, people tortured. And that was what was special about what Julian did. And as you know, he is now in Belmarsh Maximum Securities Prison. He's spent over a year there. He is not in there as a result of any crime, even the supposed crime of bail jumping that he was pulled out of transported out of the Ecuadorian embassy for, which was actually, somebody seeking asylum being misrepresented as jumping bail. He was taken out of the Ecuadorian embassy. He's in this maximum security prison. He's due to lockdown since about February. He's not been able to see either his family or his lawyers. He's alone in solitary confinement 23 hours a day. This is obviously awful for him as an individual, because after 10 years of what Professor Niels Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, clearly identifies as psychological torture, to spend a further year in isolation, being intimidated by the state, is not good for any mental health. And I'd like to quote my friend Lisa Johnson, who says that, you know, when you think of torture, you always think of physical pain, but it psychological torture is the equivalent of repeatedly breaking down somebody physically, but doing it in a way in which it isn't, the wounds are not so visible. But and then saying, oh, they're having mental health issues. Obviously, if you kick somebody in the stomach and they double over, they're not having physical health issues, they're actually being tortured. So we're so for those of you who didn't know about Julian, that's a little summary of what he and WikiLeaks have done and where he is at the moment. I'd like now to invite Jeffrey Robertson to speak, but before I do, I just wanted to quote a little paragraph, and it's about the case of the Tolpuddle martyrs, and it says, the Dorsetshire case illustrates the fact that oppression and cruelty do not always fail. Indeed, they sometimes succeed beyond the hopes of the oppressors. Unless trade unionists throughout the world are always ready to sacrifice their personal interests, their safety, or even their lives for the amelioration of the lot of the poor, their elaborate organization may perish overnight, either in a holocaust of terror and force, or in the slower process of legal repression. And Jeffrey, you will know this quote well because it is part of it's an extract from another book, but one that you've quoted in your foreword to the book. So I wondered if, for the benefit of our listeners, given you're not just a lawyer, but you're an academic and a historian, somebody who's been able to draw these parallels between the events in legal history and the realities today, if you could tell us, recount for us the story of the Tolpuddle martyrs, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. I'm going to unmute you now, Jeffrey, because I'm just so it'll. Jeffrey, you're still muted, so hopefully it should now ask you to unmute.
Unmute, there we are.
Perfect.
Now, can you hear me?
We can, thank you so much.
Good, well, good afternoon or good evening from lockdown London. The quote that you've just been read was from a judge of all people, a wonderful Australian High Court judge called Dr. Evatt, who did much to make the legend of the Tolpuddle martyr come alive in the settlement, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in other conventions that he was the architect of in the late 1940s as president of the United Nations General Assembly. But first, let me take you back to England in the 1830s. It was a place where, as the poet Goldsmith said, each wanton judge new penal statutes draw, laws grind the poor, and rich men rule the law. In the 1830s, despite the Reform Act of 1832, only 5% of people could vote. They were men of property. The only persons who could serve on juries were men of property. This was a socially static country. There was no social mobility. The nursery rhyme of the time said it all: tinker, tailor, soldier, sailor, rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief. You were typecast when you were born, and there was no chance of getting out of your social class. Except in the 1830s, there were stirrings of what was called trade unionism. There was a body, the Grand National Consolidated Union, that set up in 1834 and was developing the novel idea that workers, often earning an absolute very little, should combine against industrial factory owners and landowners to improve their lot. Now, Britain at the time had a liberal government, and like most liberal governments, it was totally supportive of the ruling class. They were called Whigs, W-H-I-G-S. Lord Melbourne at the time was the Home Secretary. And we had a dreadful king, William IV, who really despised his lesser subjects. And he said to Melbourne, we must have some check to the progress of this evil being trade unionism. And Melbourne replied that he would bring a mortal blow by the sentence of transportation to strike at the root of national trade unionism. And you know, the scapegoat that they chose were a little group of impoverished Dorset farm labourers who had, at the suggestion of a Methodist lay preacher, a man named George Lovelace, had decided to form a little friendly society to try to get some more money from the landowners of their meagre wages. Now, this society had an oath, took an oath, a rather pathetic kind of oath, where they would hold the Bible in one hand. There's a picture of a skeleton on the wall in front of them, and they would take an oath to keep their trade union secrets, and there'd be a loud voice saying, "Remember thy end." And so they were making that oath upon the Bible. But what was their object? They had rules. Let me read you their rules. No person should be admitted to their meetings when drunk. No obscene songs or toasts should be allowed. They should not countenance any violence or violation of the laws of the realm. So they were hardly a revolutionary society, these poor little half a dozen Dorsetshire labourers. But they were chosen as the scapegoats to smash nascent trade unionism. And they found a law, they always can. This was the 1797 law, Illegal Oaths Act. The Illegal Oaths Act of 1797, which was passed to stop the mutinies in the Navy. But of course, like a lot of laws, like the new treason law that the government announced yesterday, will be vague enough to encompass many others. So this poor little, pathetic little oath-taking event was chosen. And of course, they had a choice, the government. They could have charged them before the magistrates, but that only carried 3 months in prison. They charged them on indictment before a judge and jury that carried 7 years imprisonment, including transportation. Well, that was totally unnecessary, but it was necessary for the government to smash this little group. They sent a lick-spittle judge, Baron Williams, always supportive of the government, to tell the jury, and the jury didn't need any telling because they were landowners of the area who were worried about their workers combining for better wages. So of course they convicted, but what was so wicked and cruel was that the judge, who had his instructions from the government, gave them the maximum sentence, 7 years transportation to Botany Bay, although it was in fact Sydney Harbour, Port Jackson. But that was what it was called, 7 years. Now, that was so brutal. It did two things. It smashed the trade union movement. The trade union movement, the friendly societies disbanded, everyone was afraid, and it didn't rise again until the Chartists 25 years later. So it was successful in smashing the beginning of trade unionism. It wasn't the beginning, as some authors say, it was the end for the time being. But it was so cruel and disproportionate that 250,000 people signed a petition for clemency, and tens of thousands demonstrated in the streets. And of course, since it served its purpose, Lord Melbourne, who'd become Prime Minister, issued a pardon. So the men were able to come back from their convict period in Sydney. And of course, it was terrible. They were 9 months it took, and threat of scurvy and all sorts of diseases shackled to thieves and murderers. But they came back. They were welcomed back. They were given land in Dorchester, but people didn't like them. Landowners were hostile to them, and most of them, all but one, left for Canada, where they're buried today in virtually unmarked graves in Ontario. One of them is Trevor Hammett, is buried at Tolpuddle. But I think it's a dereliction in the trade union movement that at this time, where we're so concerned about symbols, about whose statue should go up and who should come down, that it's never demanded that these martyrs should be buried where all British heroes are meant to be buried, in Westminster Abbey. I think that the movement should seek to exhume them from their humble graves and ensure that trade unionism is represented. Those who were the martyrs to it, as Sidney and Beatrice Webb explained, should be buried in pride, in honour at Westminster Abbey. Now, there is another aspect that I want to draw your attention to, which led to trade unionism being protected by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Because the great study of the case of the Tolpuddle martyrs was written by a High Court judge in Australia, Dr. Evan, in 1937, a time when trade unionism was outlawed in Germany, outlawed in Japan. It was a time of the rise of fascism. And that is why this book, that obviously has some readers in Britain, but has never been published here. It's published by Sydney University Press, if we want to get a copy. But this incredibly influential little book, The Tolpuddle Martyrs, Injustice Within the Law, because Evatt argued that, in fact, the law was enabled this injustice to be done. And that's why he worried that trade unionism and other activism would be smashed by use and exploitation of laws that existed but were vague. And that is why, when he became the Foreign Minister of Australia, when he impressed, he was one of the leaders, one of the architects of the New World Order in 1946. He insisted on a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and he was the president of the General Assembly of the United Nations when he received that document from Eleanor Roosevelt, and when she said it would be the Magna Carta of mankind. And what is interesting about it is that its first draft, it was drafted by a Canadian lawyer, it made no mention of trade unionism, no mention at all. And it was Evatt who insisted that Article 23.4 of the Universal Declaration should read, "Everyone has the right to form and to join trade unions for the protection of his interests." And Article 23 went on to the right to work, equal pay for equal work, just remuneration. So that, I think, is a real legacy of the Tolpuddle martyrs. But coming back to Ebert's point is injustice within the law. How do we stop the use of laws in a cruel way? Ebert thought that the answer was a Bill of Rights, a universal declaration, a convention, which he wanted to be binding, and he thought that they would allow for restrictions on these laws.
Jeffrey.
Yes. Well, you wanted me to say a word about Julian Assange. There he is, crushed in, and he's being crushed just as the Tolpuddle martyrs were. The law that is being used to crush him is the 1921 Espionage Act, passed in hysterical times in America against communists, just like the 1797 Illegal Oaths Act. He's facing 175 years in prison. That's the total of the charges. I'll tell you what he'll get. If he is extradited to America, he has to get more than his source, Chelsea Manning, who got 35 years. So I think it's likely that he would get 50 years. In other words, that he would die in an American supermax prison. And this is extradition for a political purpose, in order to discourage other whistleblowers, in order to crush him, in order to prevent all that information, including information about American war crimes, the aerial manslaughter of the Reuters correspondents from that helicopter, and the massive information that sparked the Arab Spring and is used so much today. Well, human rights may come to his aid. We don't know. His next hearing is in September. It may be, if the British courts do their worst, that he will succeed in an appeal to the European Court of Human Rights, so long as this government doesn't abolish it, which many members really want to. So there are parallels that you can draw between the fate of the martyrs to trade unionism and the martyr to freedom of speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Very helpful and helps to really give a sense of what's at stake here. I'd now like to invite Dr. Helen Mercer. Helen's an economic historian. She's done a huge amount of work on the privatization of the NHS. And in fact, it's Helen and Emmy, who runs the Committee to Defend Julian Assange, who proposed this event in the first place, who suggested that it might be a good idea to talk about the parallels. And some of this was inspired really by Helen's written a recent article drawing those parallels between the Tolpuddle martyrs and Julian. And Helen, could you tell us a little bit about what those parallels are? You have about 8 minutes and then we'll move to Chris. Thank you. You're still muted, Helen, so if you say hello, you should be able to.
Hello, can you hear me now? Yes, okay, all right. Well, thank you very much. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much, Deepa, for organising this. I want to explain how I came to write the article, just first of all, very briefly. And that is that I went to the Tolpuddle Martyrs Festival last year. And because I had just recently actually got involved with the campaign to defend Assange, I took along leaflets and a banner, and we joined the Sunday procession, and the banner was well received there. We had a positive response. While there, I went on the trail around the village, which was provided by an excellent speaker from the Tolpuddle Martyrs Museum. And as he talked, because my head was full of Assange, I began to appreciate some of the parallels with Assange's case. And of course, over the past year, some of those parallels, I think, have sort of increased still further. There are still more that we can see. So before I talk about the similarities perhaps between the two cases, I wanted to emphasize one glaring difference between the two cases. And that is that, as with the toll puddle, the trade union movement quickly saw the implications of what was happening with the toll puddle martyrs. For them, there was a mass campaign organised, which was eventually successful in bringing them home. In the case of Assange, that mass campaign has not materialised in the same way. When the US issued its request to extradite Assange, Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott spoke out in the House of Commons against his extradition. But on the whole, the Labour Party, the trade union movement and other progressive movements have been quite quiet, and movements have been very cautious and careful. So one reason for writing the article was to try to show the importance, the relevance of what's happened in 1834 for the Assange campaign today. I also wanted, in doing it, to try and develop the sense of international solidarity in defence of Assange. The toll puddle martyrs were English people who were sentenced to transportation for trying to form a trade union, and that was a form of punishment often to be feared more than actually, say, hanging. Julian Assange is an Australian citizen who has been enduring a long and lingering punishment, effectively, before he's even been charged with anything. And he's facing still worse if he's transported to the United States. So that's the difference. But I also wanted to sort of highlight a couple of similarities. And I haven't got long, and it's quite a long article, so I'll try and be as brief as I can. So the first point is actually just emphasising what Geoffrey Robertson has just said, the use of existing laws. And in both cases, the laws were intended to suppress sedition, and the original US Espionage Act, I believe, was passed in 1917, but they're now being used to criminalise and what are legitimate and peaceful acts. So the law against taking an oath in the Navy was used to ensure the maximum penalty for taking an oath to join a trade union. The law passed against spying, the Espionage Act, is being used to gag a publisher and a journalist in a way that it's never been used before, with implications for journalists worldwide. Similarly, Assange is being portrayed as a threat to national security. The judge in 1834 told the jury that what was at stake was the safety of the country, which was clearly a pretty ridiculous claim. The second comparison concerns the importance of the interconnections between the executive and the judiciary, and also the personal connections. So at Toll Puddle, the local MP for Dorset was the chairman of the grand jury, which said that the indictment of the Toll Puddle martyrs could go ahead. He was the brother-in-law of Viscount Melbourne, who was the Home Secretary. Together, those two men, together with James Frampton, who was the local landowner, they literally hatched a plot to trap Assange in this law intended for other purposes. In the case of Assange, I think we can see a similar process. The issuing, for instance, of the European arrest warrant, and then the role of the CPS in making it very difficult, making it impossible to really close and finish the Swedish case, trapped Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy. And we also know through information released by Declassified UK of the fact that Lady Arbuthnot's husband and son have links with companies which might well might have an interest in stopping WikiLeaks revelations. So there's a conflict of interest there, potentially. And I want to make a third point quite quickly, and that's about the implications of both cases. Very often when you go back in history, cases often seem to be much more clear-cut. So in the case of the Toll Puddle martyrs, it was clear-cut. It was trade union rights fighting for social justice. In the case of Assange and WikiLeaks, the case is slightly more complex because the attack is on journalists. But why is it necessary to defend the rights of journalists to publish information in the public interest? It's important because that sort of information, the truth, can feed and nurture and grow and foster and develop popular democratic campaigns. Now, some of those campaigns are around the peace movement, and I'm that's very, very clear and very important in all of the WikiLeaks revelations. But I just wanted to say a word about the trade union movement and the situation there, because it's often forgotten. I think Deepa mentioned it, that some of the publications by WikiLeaks were of the 3 big trade agreements that were being negotiated from about 2011 onwards, and of course are being revived in the form of some of the agreements being discussed between Johnson and the United States today. Now, those big 3 trade agreements, Trans-Pacific, Trade in Services Agreement, and the Transatlantic one between the EU and the US, have been described as a Bill of Rights for corporations. And they were being negotiated secretly until the draft texts were published. And these would have ushered in further privatizations, further market deregulation, the weakening of safety standards in all sorts of areas, environmental, food, etc., all areas of major importance to the labour movement and affecting labour conditions. All the unions have opposed those 3 agreements. And I just wanted to end with a quote from one of those unions, which is the Public Sector International. Now, Public Sector International is an organisation which brings together public sector unions from about 160 different countries, representing about 20 million workers. And at the time that WikiLeaks made available the draft texts of these otherwise secret negotiations, these secret treaties, the General Secretary, she stated at the time, "It is outrageous that our democratically elected governments will not tell us the laws they are making. What has our democracy come to when the community must rely on WikiLeaks to find out what our governments are doing on our behalf?" And so the fight for labour rights in Tolpuddle is still a fight for labour rights with WikiLeaks, and it's very important that the labour movement sits up and takes note of what's going on.
Thank you, Helen. Perfectly on time. Thank you so much. And we'll come back to all 3 speakers for a few more questions, for a few specific questions in a second. But before we go on to talk to our next speaker, Chris Williamson, about how, and Chris has personal experience of this as well as professional experience of this, about how positive ideals can be weaponized for negative ends, and how smears can be employed in order to misrepresent those positive ideals. For those who are tuning in just now, I just want to make you aware, across the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll be able to see the question and answer tab. Please use that Q&A tab to post any questions for the speakers. We have the chat open. I will disable that if there is any spamming, but hopefully, right now there doesn't seem to be any, and we should be having a good discussion. So that'll continue. I'd like to remind you that the events, you might see only a few attendees here, but we're also having a lot of attendees joining us from Consortium News and also from Action for Assange. So if there are any questions from those people who are on social media, I'd be very grateful if Andrew, who's very kindly helping us from Action for Assange, and Kathy Bogan, who's helping us from Consortium News, could share those questions onto the chat. I also, for those who missed the introduction, just to quickly summarize what's happening with Julian, especially regarding his psychological torture. And I borrow in summarizing this from some excellent work that's been done by our colleagues at Doctors for Assange, and specifically an article written by Dr. Lisa Johnson, where she talks about how the psychological torture of Julian Assange has unfolded. It started with an absolutely relentless propaganda campaign. And, right now we're talking about Black Lives Matter, and indeed, Julian made visible why Black Lives Matter when he made visible that the lives in Iraq and Afghanistan were being taken without any amount of, pretty much like in the times of slavery, with little disregard for these individuals and their objectives. A lot of the smearing was around making Julian seem more and more dangerous and a malign influence. He tortured his cat, he smeared feces on the wall. I mean, the lies and the smears that came around were just absolutely atrocious. Here was a peace-loving man. Even Stratfor, which was the PR company not PR company, but the company that was intelligence company that was using that was helping the intelligence agencies said that he was a peacenik. That was the word they used. But all of them joined together to publicly humiliate him. The 5 rogue states, as I call them, America, Britain, Ecuador, Sweden, and Australia, all together vilified Julian in various ways, along with people who many of us supposedly respect in the media and in the field of law. And I'll come back to ask Jeffrey some questions about that. I've got a few questions from you on that. They've also intimidated and isolated Julian. Julian was put on an NSA manhunting target list. The CIA refused to confirm or deny whether they were planning to assassinate him. We know from more recent news out of the Spanish case that the US government plans to kidnap Julian. Even during his trial in Britain, in the first phase of the trial, which took place earlier this year, after the first day of trial, he was handcuffed, he was moved from cell to cell, he was strip searched. I go to court and I've seen how at the first hearing, which Craig Murray wrote so beautifully about, Julian, was unable to say his name and his date of birth. And this is a highly intelligent, highly capable man. And he's been tortured and reduced into somebody who's even unable to say his name. And this is the rendering of Julian to be completely helpless has also involved a huge amount of medical deprivation and neglect, which involved, for example, when he was in the embassy, he had a tooth infection. He was not allowed to, the UK government declined allowing him with the Ecuadorian consulate asked for permission to allow him to go to a hospital, and they said no. He's now in solitary confinement 23 hours a day. He's been constantly surveilled, and tapes of his surveillance have been sent to the CIA. And the arbitrary use of administrative and judicial power is something that we will come back and talk to Jeffrey about, has been intentionally about inflicting trauma on Julian. So in the context of all this, Chris, could you talk to us a little bit about how resistance and solidarity can be built around situations where positive ideals are being weaponized for negative ends, and what we and many of us here on this call are supporters, are people who are trying to understand more about what's really going on in the world. And would you share some thoughts, please, Chris? You have about 8 to 10 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed for the invitation, Deepa, and it's great to be joining the other speakers on the panel today to talk about this really important issue. And it is an issue, I think, that should exercise the minds of all of us who are concerned about human rights and social justice. And it's really interesting to draw the parallels, I think, with what happened to the Tolpuddle martyrs. And some people might think that's a sort of rather a curious parallel to draw. But when you consider the way in which Julian has been abused and how laws have been manipulated to incarcerate him in the way in which they've done at the moment, with a view to extraditing him, and the way in which the laws which Jeffrey outlined, the rather obscure piece of legislation, 1797 Unlawful Oaths Act, that were used against these 7 Tolpuddle martyrs to address a threat, as it was perceived at that time, by the establishment. And of course, Julian is someone who has performed an incredibly important international public service in actually drawing attention to the abuse of state power and the abuse of corporate power. And what I think is really inspiring about what happened in the case of the Tolpuddle martyrs, the fact that as a consequence of the really grotesque unfairness which was meted out to them, it led to a mass outpouring of opposition from the movement, the labour movement, the burgeoning labour movement at that time, and the wider general public. And it's a real lesson, I think, that we need to try and draw parallels with today and learn from that and use that as a guiding principle, if you like, to support Julian, because it is so important that he receives as much support as possible, because he, as I say, is someone who is an incredibly important international figure. And if they are successful, of course, then it is going to have a profound effect, I think, on our civil liberties, on our human rights. And it's really interesting that how Julian, as you were just saying there, Deepa, was smeared in the similar way to the Tolpuddle martyrs were smeared as well by the landed gentry of the day, in order to try and justify the actions and to sort of toxify them in a sense. And this is what we're seeing today. And we see it in terms of the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn's election to the leadership of the party was an unassuming man who'd spent his life fighting for human rights and for international justice. Who's somebody who, at a time when people like David Cameron were wearing T-shirts that had Hang Mandela emblazoned across them, Jeremy was protesting against apartheid outside the South African embassy. And he never sought the leadership of the party. And people will probably know the story. The Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs met and went around the room to determine who could be a potential candidate in the leadership election in 2015. And it was, as it were, kind of Buggins' turn almost, really. Kind of Jeremy, others had tried and failed, and it was felt important that somebody carried the torch of a socialist alternative into that debate. And so Jeremy put his hat into the ring, succeeded in getting sufficient number of nominations at the very last minute, I think with literally a few seconds to spare, literally, I think less than a minute to spare before the deadline passed, where the candidates to get onto the ballot paper had to achieve, I think it was 35 or 36 MP nominations, and Jeremy managed to get the last couple or three at the very, very last moment. And it unleashed an outpouring of hope and enthusiasm, which had not been seen. I'd never witnessed it, I've got to say, and I'd been a member of the Labour Party for 40 odd years at that time. But at the same time as it inspired so many people and encouraged this mass sort of movement to join the Labour Party and get involved in politics for the first time, there was a very adverse reaction from the establishment inside the Labour Party, from the wider establishment in the country, who absolutely didn't want to see someone like Corbyn coming to the fore, who was going to challenge the status quo. Just as the Tolpuddle martyrs were challenging the status quo, just as Julian Assange is challenging a status quo which has allowed human rights abuses, war crimes to be committed by the most powerful nation on earth. And it was unconscionable that it was this upstart from Australia actually exposing what the United States of America have been actually perpetrating on innocent people. And, all of the kind of propaganda that went into, as we know, the dodgy dossier and all the rest of it to try and justify the war in Iraq. And, Julian once said, didn't he, at a rally, that all wars are started with lies. And he said, if wars can be started with lies, then then peace can be started with truth. And it's, I think, a really profound statement that Julian made there. And it's really instructive, I think, to see how a truth teller like Julian has been smeared and demonized in the way in which he has, and the way in which other, like Jeremy Corbyn, was demonized, the way in myself, for that matter, and people who support a ethical foreign policy. Let's just remember the power of the military-industrial complex, and remember also that Julian, wasn't just somebody who exposed war crimes; he was exposing, the abuse of corporate power. The military-industrial complex is incredibly powerful on this side of the Atlantic, obviously very powerful in the United States of America as well. They benefit hugely from the destabilization of the Middle East, for example, because every missile that is fired generates a huge profit. These are incredibly expensive hardware, and so it's in their interests to have this kind of conflicts going on around the world, this sort of turmoil in all parts of the world. And for Julian to be exposing this, for Jeremy Corbyn to be a potential prime minister, especially with the kind of mass support that he was getting for his ideas, it was unconscionable that could be allowed to happen. And therefore, a massive campaign was mounted to smear him. He was accused of being a Czech spy. He was accused of being an IRA terrorist sympathizer, of venerating terrorists in the Middle East. And of course, the most pernicious accusation, which gained traction, was that he was an anti-Semite, and essentially all of his supporters, or many of his supporters, the allegation went, were anti-Semites. I mean, this was an allegation that was thrown against me, and we saw the smears against Julian with the Swedish accusations that were made about him being an alleged rapist and so on. And all this is done in order to make the subject, Jeremy Corbyn, Julian Assange, to make them a toxic figure, to make it very difficult to support them, and indeed to make it difficult to support the Palestinian people. And so we do need, I think, to be mindful of this and recognize the way in which the media is deployed in a very pernicious way to misrepresent the truth, to misrepresent the views of individuals. And I think the way in which we can challenge that is through solidarity. It's through recognizing the power of our collective joint effort. Because, when we stand together, we're incredibly powerful. I mean, the establishment does have a lot of power because it has a lot of wealth. But when ordinary people stand together in unison, in solidarity, then, in my opinion, we are undefeatable. And if you think back to the parallels with the Tolpuddle martyrs, when it became a real cause célèbre, of course, I guess Lovelace and the rest of them, when they were boarding those ships to be transported, didn't probably think in their wildest dreams that within a couple of years or so they would be returning, and that it would create such an outpouring of concern and opposition on the streets. But it's really encouraging to think that incident led to a petition of, I think it was around 800,000 people, a march of 100,000 people, and this really scared the government. And what we need, I think, to do in relation to the Julian Assange case is to kind of draw inspiration from that and recognize the huge importance of this case, of Julian's case. This isn't just about one man, important though that is, because his rights are being trampled on. He's being treated in the most despicable way. I mean, this is a real stain on Britain's character as a nation that, used to sort of pride itself on standing up for human rights. To treat an individual in this way is absolutely beyond the pale. But the truth is, it's not simply about Julian Assange. This is about all of us. This is about our collective civil rights, our right to expect the state to represent the interests of ordinary people and to stand up for human rights. And somebody like Julian Assange, who is a truth teller, is such a key and important individual. And if this case is lost, then it does not only has implications, I think, for our civil liberties, it certainly has implications for the future of a free press and our ability to know the truth and find out the truth. So I would urge any journalists out there to get on the case, to stand up and speak out and draw strength from each other. We are, when we stand together, just to kind of repeat that point, we are incredibly powerful. In the words of Percy Shelley, I would say to those journalists, you need to rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep seems to have fallen on you, because we are many and they are few. And if we do that, then I'm confident that we can get a fair and just result for Julian. And that, of course, will bode well for all of us into the future.
Thank you, Chris. Perfect timing. I'd like to go back to Helen, if I may, to just draw a little bit about, a bit more detail about how in the case of the Tolpuddle martyrs and in the case of Julian Assange, how justice has been undermined and how resistance pretty much has been undermined by elites using lawfare and smearing. And I know you wanted to talk about this in your introduction, Helen, and I wondered if there was anything further you wanted to say about it.
Yes, thank you. I think it's one of the parallels I drew in the article was between the role of the clergy in the early 19th century and the role of the modern media today. And the clergy in those days acted as a sort of, well, sermons from the pulpit could really form opinions, particularly in rural communities like Tolpuddle. And that the clergy identified materially and ideologically with the landed interests. And the clergy on the whole preached a sort of quiescence with the social order. You know, there's a famous little hymn that we used to sing when there was regular morning assemblies called All Things Bright and Beautiful. And there's a verse in that, which is, the rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. And that was what the church preached. They preached a quiescence, which I think is also very much what the media tends to do at the moment. But George Lovelace also made a great, amazing, big attack, impassioned attack on the church. And he pointed out how on every proposal for social justice, for bettering the interests of the working class, for bettering people's conditions, they were opposed. They supported the Poor Law Amendment Act, and they helped to beat the drum for war. And those same things, exactly the same things, could be said about the media and their treatment of Julian Assange today. And George Lovelace said at one point, "What chancer has a labouring man of obtaining justice if the clergyman of the parish is ill disposed towards him?" And exactly the same could be said about the media. And the clergy smeared him. Smeared George Lovelace, smeared the Tolpuddle Martyrs, made it very difficult for them to stay in Essex, where they had houses given to them, and that they were seen as troublemakers, as bad and wicked men. And I think we just see the same thing playing out in the media today with the smears against Assange. And when you leaflet for Assange, the very common thing thrown at you is, not always, you generally meet a fairly positive response, but you know, he's a rapist, he's a narcissist, he's this terrible person, which are all lies and smears. And I think it's quite useful to see a manual being played through. There's a manual being played through with the media. We could call it the military-industrial complex, the government. A manual being played through to smear. And I wanted to just make another point, though, that while I can draw these comparisons between the 19th century and today, weirdly, in one way, it was perhaps easier for people to learn the truth about the Tolpuddle Martyrs in the early 19th century than it is today. Because although in the very recent past, before the Tolpuddle Martyrs, there'd been a series of what were called gagging acts passed, there was still quite a vibrant radical press. The Dorchester court had a press gallery, and George Lovelace made an impassioned speech, and that was reported quickly around the country by that radical press. And many members of that radical press were operating against the laws of the day. They would be imprisoned, sometimes many times, in order to maintain their ability to put out the truth. Now that's quite significant, and it meant actually that in some ways they escaped through that radical press the monopolisation of the media that we see today.
Thanks, Helen. I'd now like to move on to Geoffrey Robertson again, but before I do, could I just remind everybody, please could you post your questions on the Q&A tab? Could I also remind the speakers who are not speaking to have a quick look at the Q&A tab so you're aware of what the questions are. Please also continue to post your questions on social media, and Kathy at Consortium News and Andrew at Action for Assange will be sharing those with us via the Zoom. And also, you know, talking about the mainstream media not covering the case and how depressing that is, I also want to acknowledge some people who have covered the case. And in particular, I'd like to acknowledge John Pilger, who's been a staunch friend and supporter from the start. Craig Murray, another exceptional individual, and huge solidarity to Craig as he goes through this awful persecution at the moment in his own case in relation to contempt of court. I'd also like to acknowledge Joe Laria and Kathy at Consortium News, Andrew and others at Action for Assange. I'd like to acknowledge Taylor Hudak, Susie Dawson, people like Mohamed El-Mazi and Tariq Haddad, who continue to cover the case, Marty Silk, who posts about the case, Elizabeth Leah Voss. And I'm sure I'm missing out a lot of very good people, but thank you so much to these alternative and mainstream journalists, people like Patrick Coburn and Peter Roborn, who continue to say something about this, because we need to hear from you, and we need for you to, and we need people here to acknowledge their voice. And even if you're one person, it is important that you try and convince your friends, your family about the importance of this case. Please join us when we have the Emmy and Clara and the others, Joe and others at Action for Us, at the Committee to Defend Julian Assange have lots of events. Please attend those events. Please join Ian and me at the Free the Truth events. Let's talk about this and let's break through this mainstream media silence on the case. But back now to our expert, Jeffrey. Jeffrey, could you say a little bit about, you started to talk about injustice when we had to, kind of unnaturally shorten that speech. And I know there were a couple of comments from the audience that they wanted to hear more from you. In particular, would you be able to talk a little bit about the rule of law and state accountability and how that's been undermined in Julian's case? Because, Niels Meltzer and others have pointed this out repeatedly, but Meltzer is not really being heard in the mainstream media that much. So could you tell us a little bit about that, please? Jeffrey, you're still muted, so I'm just going to ask you to unmute, and hopefully it'll allow you to unmute again.
There we are. Well, I might make a comment first about Helen's last point. You're very right in pointing out how the bishops, and they were bishops of the Church of England, the established church, and they were, of course, in favor of the establishment, and they did a lot to harm the attempts to improve the state of the poor, because they saw themselves as part of the establishment. Well, of course, they still are. Incredibly, we still have the Church of England as the established church, and we give them 26 bishops in the House of Lords. They are now more concerned about the poor, I'll give them that, but never a word about Julian Assange. Still pretty poor for a church that claims now to be sensitive to human rights. But you asked me about the way the law is being used. Now, I think it's important that Dr. Evatt's insight should be kept in front of us. It's injustice because it's savage what is being done to crush Assange, to send him on his way to an American supermax for 50 years in prison. That means he'll die in prison. This is the object of the Mike Pompeo. There's a good piece about this evangelical right-wing Tory fellow who's suddenly achieved a great deal of power, who wants to arrest judges of the International Criminal Court should they come to the United Nations. I mean, some of his ideas, and will not, of course, extradite Anne Succulus to face the music for killing young Harry Dunn. This is the double standards, but this is the current American administration. Of course, Chelsea Manning, the original whistleblower, was pardoned by President Obama. I don't see Julian Assange, if he is extradited, being pardoned by President Trump if he gets a second term. But what we are seeing at operation level is the ability of the very wealthy, and in this case, the incredibly powerful American State Department, which has acquired film, video of Julian Assange in the embassy meeting with his lawyers, a gross invasion of his privacy, which no doubt they will try to use against him, and using the old Espionage Act as a basis. Of course, Britain could put a stop to it, and no doubt, Jeremy Corbyn had been elected, he would. But it will now go full course, and for years, Julian Assange will be in this prison at risk of COVID-19 and unable to produce his full commitment to defending himself. He has a good defense because clearly he's being persecuted for his political efforts, but nonetheless, he'll have to stay in prison. He should have got bail. He could have been kept in the country with electronic tabs and reporting to police. The prospects of him getting into the Russian embassy or wherever would be negligible. But no, he has to remain, and perhaps for years, in prison. But this is using the law. These are actions, as Everett said, injustice, certainly within the law. And it is still, although Everett's solution was to create overriding laws of human rights and so forth that would trump the actual severe and disproportionate use of existing laws. But of course, that will take some time. It may be that the guarantee of freedom of speech in the Human Rights Act will, in time, secure the release of Julian Assange. But what is unacceptable is the length of time that he will have to spend in Belmarsh as a martyr to free speech while we try to sort out. And in America, one hopes that the First Amendment will protect him, it's stronger. But of course, the Trump lawyers are arguing that it doesn't, the First Amendment protections that protected the New York Times over the Pentagon Papers don't apply to non-Americans, which, and because Assange is Australian, he doesn't get the American benefit of freedom of speech. And that is a danger for all non-American journalists. Many British journalists work for American papers. So the attack on Assange has this consequence of being an attack on free speech protections in America itself. So that's the reality of the Assange situation.
Thank you, Geoffrey. And just on that note, in relation to whistleblowing, one of the terrible things about this case is the way in which we are not able to hold our governments to account for the crimes they commit in our name. And Julian Assange, and of course, brave whistleblowers like Chelsea, allowed that to happen, because without them, we would not have known the scale of the atrocities in Iraq and Afghanistan. Coming back to our discussion with you, Chris, about solidarity and resistance, could I ask you to say a little bit about how, in effect, how our activists who are being ground down can come together to organize? Because this is a very, very practical question in terms of, how do you handle things like smearing and control of the media discourse? I know, for example, that you've now started putting out information, a counter narrative through the ways you're organizing. So could you tell us a little bit about that? Sorry, Chris, I've muted you, so let me just try and unmute you again.
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me now? Can you hear me okay, Deepa?
Perfect, thank you.
All right, great, thank you. Well, look, we're trying to organise a new grassroots movement. I think there's never been a greater need for extra parliamentary activities, because unfortunately, our representative democracy, I don't believe, has been actually delivering for people. It's not actually serving the interests of the people that actually elect them. It tends to prioritize the interests of the elites and the corporate class. I mean, you know, if representative democracy was working, we wouldn't have so much inequality and poverty in Britain. But one of the questions on the chat there was to me, directed at me, saying, how do I keep motivated? And, you know, sort of deprecating the attacks on Jeremy and myself and, of course, others. And I guess the thing that keeps me going is the fact that this is such an important issue. There are so many injustices that, you know, we do need to continue to fight them. And I've been inspired, obviously, by people like Julian. Julian's made an incredible sacrifice to do what he's done, and languishing now in Belmarsh prison. And you know, people like Fred Hampton, who was the one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party in the States, was assassinated by the American authorities, the Chicago police and the FBI. A young 21-year-old man who was an incredibly profound young individual, but was seen as at such a tender age a threat to the interests of the establishment in the United States of America at the time, because he was bringing together poor white working class and the black working class. And he made the point in one of his speeches that, you know, you don't fight racism with black racism, you fight it with solidarity. You don't fight capitalism with black capitalism, you fight it with socialism. And he was seen as a real threat because he was getting real traction for that message. And I think one of the reasons why I was targeted was because I was making a case for democracy inside the Labour Party, for participatory democracy inside the Labour Party, and that was something which was untenable to virtually the entirety of the parliamentary Labour Party, who didn't want to make themselves accountable in the way in which I was advocating. And I just think that if our democracy is going to survive in a meaningful way, then we do need to examine how it's functioning right now and to call for something better. And that can only happen, I think, if more of us, you know, stand together and do actually, you know, demand this, because unless we do that, nothing's ever given from those in power. It has to be fought for, just as the Tolpuddle martyrs made the sacrifices that they made, and then the huge outpouring of support that they achieved forced the governments of the day to make the changes that they did. Achieving the vote wasn't just kind of handed down, it was fought for. And we have to, I think, take inspiration from those pioneers who made those advances for us in the past, because many of those advances are under extreme threat right now. You look at the precarious employment, which is now endemic across the land, as I've already mentioned, the scale of poverty and inequality. And that's why I say that, you know, the need for a new grassroots movement, what the need for extra parliamentary activities, and it is possible, you know, to make a difference, to bring pressure to bear, to force policymakers, lawmakers to change their ways, but also to actually simply do things for ourselves. Where the state failure, let's just do it for ourselves. And again, the way in which the Panthers did in the States, where they, you know, their famous breakfast clubs for young kids who were going to school hungry, they dealt with that. The cooperative pioneers in this country, working class people coming together. There was state failure, obviously, at that time, to actually represent the interests of the vast majority of working class people. So I think taking that kind of inspiration from from history, taking inspiration from those iconic figures like Fred Hampton, like Malcolm X, Nelson Mandela, people like that, Julian, of course, currently, who've made, as I say, such sacrifices in their personal lives to try and improve the lot for the rest of us. It's kind of incumbent upon us, I think, to actually, you know, do what we can to rally people. And I just think that a grassroots movement, if we can actually, you know, raise people's consciousness, the sort of work, if you like, that Julian was trying to do, but we need to kind of spread that much wider, but to raise consciousness about the, you know, the injustices that people are having to kind of wrestle with on a daily basis, and to raise people's expectations. That's what I'm hoping a grassroots movement can achieve, and through collective solidarity, through that combined sort of pincer approach, if you like, of raising expectations and raising political consciousness, then we can actually make a difference. I really do. We can do things for ourselves, and we can also force policymakers and indeed nurture new parliamentarians and local authority representatives through that process. Because if our current representatives are failing, and they are, well, let's replace them with people who will do the job. Because otherwise, democracy is going to die, and it's, without that, then as Tony Benn once said, and I often quote this: democracy is the most revolutionary thing in the world, and we need to fight for it, because unless we fight for it, we might lose it.
Thank you, Chris. I have a bunch of questions, and I know Jeffrey's going to leave a little bit, might have to leave a little bit early, and it's not yet exactly clear exactly what time he would leave. So I'll start with those questions for you, Jeffrey, if I may. Couple of questions, roughly in the same ballpark. One is very specific, and it's one that many of us have tried to get answered at previous meetings and have had little success with getting answered. And that is there any risk, however negligible, of Julian not being granted leave to appeal? And how is this being considered? And I appreciate that, because you are, of course, advising on the wider team that Gareth is, we don't want you to disclose any legal strategy. We don't need to know. But also, in relation to that, I think a step back, really, many of us are really, really ashamed of the role that Keir Starmer's DPP has played in persecuting Julian. Particularly, we're concerned about holding people like Paul Close, Marianne Nee, Magistrate Arbuthnot to account for the ways in which they have, in some ways, for many of us who are not really legal experts, we are concerned that they may be showing misfeasance in public office. And so it would be useful to get a sense from you about what your thoughts are about what, I'm just an ordinary supporter who got really vexed at the way in which there was no public debate and started organizing these events. I'm an academic at the university. I don't specifically teach whistleblowing, although my colleague Ian Munro does. And we're all trying to get together and use our professional skills and our personal skills to offer Julian some support, but also to save our democracy in the way Chris has outlined. So could you give us some suggestions as to, we have some lawyers on the chat who are particularly keen to hear from you. I'm going to unmute you. Jeffrey, what Chris has said.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
I'm not acting for Julian on this one, but my chambers is, and I've got great confidence in his team. But I don't think Keir Starmer, also a former member of my chambers, is involved. He wasn't the DPP at the time, and of course the American government is entitled to apply for extradition, just as Britain is entitled to apply for extradition of Americans, although, as I pointed out, the hypocrite Pompeo refuses in the case of Anne Suckless, the driver who killed young Harry Dunn. But nonetheless, they are entitled, and they use the Crown Prosecution Service to bring the case. But Keir Starmer has no connection with that. Now, it's brought at Westminster Magistrates Court. That is the name of the court where the hearing is going on. I was very concerned when the first magistrate, just after he'd been dragged out of the Ecuadorian embassy, insulted him by calling him a coward and so forth, and a narcissist. I think that was wrong. It was not a good look for British justice. But they're really magistrates, but they've been calling themselves now, or allowed to be called, district judges. So I suppose we must call them judges, but they're at the lowest level of the pecking order of legal goes against Julian if the magistrate or the district judge refuses to accept that he's being prosecuted for political purposes to deter whistleblowers and refuses to accept that his right of free speech is at stake, then there is an appeal. There is an appeal to a higher court, to a couple of judges and who are high court judges, and then there is an appeal to our Supreme Court, which is 7 judges, you'll remember, led until recently by Lady Hale. But so he does have a right to appeal. I think he will be granted leave to appeal to the Supreme Court because the case involves so much of legal interest. He will certainly have a right of appeal to what is called the Divisional Court, the High Court judges. Then he has a right to seek appeal to the Supreme Court. So that will enable him. But of course, these things take time, and it will be several years before he is entitled to address an appeal if he loses. It may be that the Westminster Magistrates Court will release him. It may be that if they don't, that he will succeed at the High Court, Divisional Court level, and it may be that if he doesn't, that he will get leave to appeal to the Supreme Court. But in the meantime, regrettably, he must stay because he's not being allowed bail despite conditions that he would be prepared to accept that would preclude him from leaving a country property. He will have to stay in Belmarsh with suspected terrorists and murderers for another 2 years.
Thank you, Geoffrey. I think to some extent, I think I understand what you're saying about Keir Starmer himself not being involved, but it does, I mean, it is quite apparent that he was clearly the DPP when Paul Close's information wasn't disclosed, and we've had information from people like Matt Kennard talking about the kinds of conversations.
I don't know about those cases at all, so I can't pass judgment on them.
Of course. One of the things we must highlight here is that Julian has been denied bail despite the fact that he has a chronic lung condition. And for those of you who may not be aware, another whistleblower, Reality Winner, has now contracted COVID in the US, despite being, you know, she had also asked for bail because of her conditions and because of being a non-violent prisoner. And so Julian continues to be at risk. And as you know, COVID is a disease that attacks the lungs. And he's even, what was quite upsetting for many of us was that when we go to court, we find that he's being asked to use a shared interview room where the shared spaces would put him at risk of COVID. And the judges makes the point that she does not think his medical conditions merit him being granted either bail or being allowed to not present himself in some ways. So this is, for many of us sitting on the outside, we are not, again, legal experts. This does feel extremely unfair. And
well, the Committee Against Torture, the UN Committee Against Torture, has pointed out that it is a mental torture to keep non-violent prisoners in jail during the COVID-19 pandemic, which particularly hits prisons as hotspots. And what they've recommended to every country is that they release on bail those non-violent prisoners who aren't dangerous, particularly if they're yet to be tried. And Britain has released over 300 prisoners in that category, but it has not released, and doesn't look as though it will, it has not released, sadly, Julian Assange. And I notice people keep trying to get at Keir Starmer, and this is nonsense, because he was DPP years ago when the Swedish brought their case, but they brought it under European legislation, under the European arrest warrant. So he had no alternative as head of the CPS to allow it to go ahead. So forget Keir Starmer as having anything to do with Julian Assange's problems. I can't hear you.
Rookie error. I muted myself. Another question that's coming from, and this might be a question for you, Chris, is it looks like the author, Brian Vickery, says, apart from a few brave individuals, including Chris, it looks like Labour MPs have gone on walkabout. Why are they not jumping up and down on what is happening to Julian Assange, our free press and our justice system? Are they turning into the Clinton wing of the DNC, just interested in power and what they can get out of the system? Chris, over to you.
Well, it certainly feels like that. I mean, I was very disappointed when I was still in the House that I was the only MP, apart from Diane in her role as the Shadow Home Secretary and Jeremy, who as lead, obviously, leader of the party, leader of the opposition, who raised Julian's case. I'm unaware of any other MP doing so. And I think one of the, well, others did actually. I mean, many of them raised issues about the allegations relating to the Swedish charges that were brought and actually dropped and never really pursued. But they were embellished, of course, as well, to suggest that there was accusation being made about something that actually wasn't true. And that is very regrettable. And I do think that, to be honest with you, that the parliamentary party has been absent in this in a way which I think is, well, it brings the party into some disrepute, really, as a party that ought to be standing up for an issue like this, standing up for human rights and so on. And they've been asleep at the wheel, in my opinion, or worse. And there is a parallel definitely with the DNC, and it's almost, again, at the point I was making a little bit earlier on, really, where it seems our representatives on both sides of the chamber are more interested in representing the interests of the elites and the corporate sector than they are the wider public and really important issues like this. And so it's incumbent, I think, on all of us, those that do care about it, the many, if you like, to bring pressure, because in the end, these individuals are all democratically elected, and obviously they rely on the support of the electorate to enjoy the power that they've got. So I think it's really important that we do bring pressure on individual MPs to ask what are they doing about this. And if we can get enough people to do that, then hopefully it will wake people up. But yeah, I mean, it is regrettable that we're seeing very, very little sign of any sort of interest or concern about Julian's plight. I'm not sure that any other MP, for example, other than myself, had been to any of the vigils outside Belmarsh. And when you think back to the tradition that we used to see as a common feature of the Labour Party, Parliamentary Labour Party, where you would see MPs standing up and speaking out and joining in on important issues of the day. I mean, even people like Shirley Williams, for example, was arrested on the Grunwick picket line in 1977. So, it was quite a common feature, which no longer seems to be the case. And all we can do, therefore, it seems to me, is pressure individual MPs at a local level, see them at the local surgery, and if people are still members of the party, I know a lot of people have left, but to be raising this through the constituency meetings when the MPs come and speak to local members, because it's totally unacceptable. The Labour, well, all parliamentarians should be concerned about this, but for the Labour Party of all political parties, they should be leading the charge and speaking out on this issue in relation to Julian.
Thanks, Chris. And just to clarify, there are a couple of updates. One, just very quickly, and this is a clarification just in terms of the terminology, because we're becoming much more hot on the terminology now. And just to say, Julian has never been charged with anything in Sweden. His case was always at preliminary investigation stage. And the bandying about of this term in the mainstream media, charges, Swedish, whatever, is one way in which they have maligned and undermined Julian. So I would urge you to join with Emmy at the Committee to Defend Julian Assange to correct the record when you see any of the mainstream newspapers, because they will cover the case in September, some of them, even if they only devote about 80 words to it, while they devote several thousand words to something which is completely inconsequential. But please correct the record as we go through. I'd also like to point out that Richard Bergen and John McDonnell spoke at an event which was organised under the Don't Extradite Assange campaign banner. Richard Bergen has now sponsored an early day motion. You can encourage your MP to sign this. Please use the automated template, which is on the Don't Extradite Assange website, to contact your MP in order for the MP to recognise. Please also pick up the phone, as in try and meet them in person. If there are virtual surgeries, please meet them through virtual surgeries, as Chris explained, in order to push the case for Julian. And also, more recently, I think yesterday, Claudia Webber was on a Don't Extradite Assange webcast. So I'm hoping that some other MPs are starting to get a bit more aware and a bit more involved. But you're right, Chris. You're the only one who stood with us at the vigils and has been there from the start. And when you put your first early day motion, it was shameful to see so many Labour MPs sitting tight. But I'm glad that at least Richard's motion has got more support.
No, that's encouraging, and it is encouraging to see. Well, say encouraging. I mean, it's very limited, but I mean, it's Richard and John that are speaking out now. I mean, I guess I was referring to the period prior to the new regime that's running the party. And it would have been nice to have seen others speaking out then, when there was prospects of a Corbyn-led Labour government. But no, I mean, I think, and certainly, as you say, seeing MPs at their virtual surgeries, or when the lockdown measures, the social distancing measures are removed, to actually go and see them in person, I think it's quite powerful. But in the meantime, absolutely get them to sign the so-called early day motion. It's like a parliamentary petition. It's a very easy thing for an MP to do. Whether Labour MPs or not, actually, all MPs can be asked. These are cross-party motions, and it's just an indication, really, of the strength of opinion of backbench members of Parliament. And obviously, the more that can be persuaded to sign, the more potentially influential it can be. It's a very low-level thing, very easy for MPs to do, and certainly if we can get members of the public to press their MP, then that can have the effect of alerting them to the particular EDM. I can't remember the number of the EDM, Deepa. It might be useful, if you've got it, to just give people the number of the EDM, and then when people contact their MP, they can say sign EDM and whatever number it is in support of Julian Assange. Thank you, Chris.
I'll try and get somebody to put that in the chat. Helen, I noticed you were going to say something about this. Do you want to go now, please?
Thank you. Yes. I mean, just to embellish a couple of points there, and just to add that the Caroline Lucas of the Green Party has now signed that early day motion. And I think I think there was a question or a point on the chat or the Q&A at one point about environmentalists and involving environmentalists in the campaign for Assange, because he's also revealed the role of certain companies in dumping toxic chemicals and things like this. So I think that's a very important development. Just on the point of the Labour Party, I think one of the reasons that the Labour Party might find it difficult to come in on this is because when you look at some of the things that happened under the Blair government, I mean, particularly, for instance, Iraq, the war in Iraq, but you could also look at something like PFI. I think on the whole, most people within the Parliamentary Labour Party find it very, very difficult to accept mistakes, or whatever you want to call them, that were made during that period of the Labour governments from 1997. And a lot of what Assange has revealed is related to the Iraq War, for instance. So I think that that's a sort of, it's one of the reasons why it's very difficult to get the to get it really up front with the Labour Party, that unwillingness to acknowledge. And I mean, Corbyn was a breath of fresh air from that point of view, because there was that willingness to look back over the Iraq War and the war crimes and other elements that happened during that time. And the other point I just wanted to make very quickly about the role of the media. I mean, the role of the media and the smears and the lies against Assange have been incredibly powerful, and they will have influenced the Labour Party. And I think that while it's very important to fight struggles around the issue of race and sex discrimination, there is a tendency for identity politics to take over. And to a certain extent, the media smears have sort of played on the fertile ground created by some of the more extreme elements within identity politics.
Thank you, Helen. I have two questions. I know we've slightly gone over the 2:30 mark, which we had kind of penciled, but there are two very good questions that I'd like to ask if the speakers are happy to stay for a few more minutes. The first of these relates to the D notice. And I wasn't sure, because we don't have any media experts specifically, although Jeffrey, you do media law. Am I right? I apologize. One of the things they've asked is, and this was asked at a webinar yesterday and elsewhere as well, how does the D notice system how is it potentially being used to stifle any debate about Julian? Because prior to the breaking of the Guardian computers thing, the D notices were seen, and I spoke to a journalist yesterday who was saying, oh, the D notices is an advisory. But really, there seems to be an absolutely unnatural silence around what's happening to Julian. And do you have any thoughts about how the DSMA committee might be affecting this, and any comments on that?
There we are. One thing I would and should say is, and which I left out of my legal explanation, is that although he has a right to appeal to the High Court if his case is turned down, and he has a right to apply for the Supreme Court to hear it, whatever the Supreme Court says can be countermanded by the British government. It's for Britain, the politicians, the government, to decide at the end of the day, whatever the courts say, whether we'll hand over Julian Assange to die in a supermax. And you remember the case. We did it by Chebs, but it's got out, the name of the man has gone out of my mind, an autistic man who was accused of hacking into important American bases. And the courts decided that he should, in fact, be extradited. And it was Theresa May, it was her government that decided, because of the risk of him committing suicide in the American prison, that he would not be. So at the end of the day, extradition is a political decision. And although MPs of all sides, and David Davis actually has been supportive of Assange from the right, MPs of all sides are reluctant to put motions down when a case is actually in court, that it should be a matter for MPs of all sides to understand correctly, and not because of the demonization that he's been subject to understand the background, to understand the dangers for freedom of speech, to understand how Britain, which was once in the past the great defender and protector of Mazzini and of Marx and Kropotkin and all those European radicals, that how shameful it's been in its handling of Assange. So it's quite right and important that MPs clue themselves up on the truth about the American persecution of Julian Assange. It's understandable that they may not feel it right to speak out while the case is in motion, but certainly, given that it's a political decision at the end of the day, they should prepare and gird their loins for a political battle.
Thank you. There's one further question, which is about, sorry, I've lost my place in the questioning. One of the questions is there any way of cutting this court process short on the grounds of, firstly, the accusations being frivolous, and I'm not sure the state would see that this way, but it seems that this case is being used not just to send a message to the media about what they can and cannot say, but also to clamp down on the kinds of information that WikiLeaks would be able to effectively do now, especially, for example, during COVID or other national crises. So do you have any thoughts on whether...
Well, I mean, the British government, look, the Americans are entitled under our extremely fair laws to come to court and to demand his extradition. But ultimately, it is a political decision of who we send off. And when we asked Mr. Pompeo for the extradition of the woman who'd killed a young Briton by driving on the wrong side of the road, he tore up the extradition request. He said it was abusive. So Britain never actually got to court on it. So it perfectly, the government could perfectly properly say, we're ending this now, full stop. But I don't think this government would do that. It could be asked.
Thank you.
I'll have to leave now, but thank you for chairing.
Thank you very much for joining us, Geoffrey. Really helpful. Could I now ask for final summary comments from Chris, Helen, and also actually invite Ian, who's been very kindly co-chairing, but helping in the background, setting things up, if any of them have any final comments to make. So may I start with you, Helen?
Well, thank you very much. I think it's been a very useful discussion. I think I just wanted to sort of make a final point about the lessons of history. And I was expecting a few more questions about history and the lessons of history. But I think that, sorry, there are dogs barking in the background. We need to learn from history. And I think the point I would make is that what we're seeing with Assange is, I think what we face in Britain and elsewhere is a very long established, a very old, a very experienced ruling class, ruling elite, establishment, whatever you want to call them, who are used to being highly repressive, also know when to retreat and when to compromise at various times. But some of the same families are still in control as they were in the early 19th century and as they were in the 18th century. And that length of holding on to power and what they've used is what I would call a manual of repression. And I think we need to learn from history about what that manual of repression consists of. And that's why the parallel, even with a case which doesn't seem related, like Assange with Tolpuddle Martyrs, is important to make, because it's all about us understanding history and the manual of repression. And that's why I wrote the article, and that's what I hope people might take away.
Thank you, Helen. If you wouldn't mind posting that article in the chat for the viewing of all attendees, you will find it on the Wise Up Action website anyway. but that's the website maintained by the Committee to Defend Julian Assange. And of course, please use the Don't Extradite Assange campaign website for the MP's letter. I'd now like to go to Chris Williamson for final thoughts, please.
Right. Yes. No. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, well, let me just pick up on something that that Geoffrey was saying at the end there, and in relation to what can be done. I mean, in the end, yes, this is a political decision, and so as electors, we need to be putting pressure, it seems to me, on our policymakers, on our lawmakers, to do the right thing. And in that process, what I would urge people to do is look at the extradition treaty between the UK and the US. And look, I'm not a lawyer, obviously. I'm just an ex-bricklayer. But it seems to me, reading it, it's fairly clear that Julian Assange, under that treaty, shouldn't be incarcerated at the moment. Absolutely should not be facing extradition, because it says in the Article 4 of the extradition treaty that extraditions are not legitimate if the request is a political request, or should I say, if it's a political offence, I beg your pardon. Well, it's absolutely clear to me that Julian is guilty of a political offence. And it then lists in the extradition treaty a range of circumstances in which people can be extradited, but then goes on to say further down that if, in the opinion of the government, the request is politically motivated, then even though the criteria might be met for extradition, if it's deemed it's a politically motivated request, then it shall not be granted. Well, to me, it's absolutely black and white and open and shut case as far as I'm concerned. So I think when lobbying MPs, I think it's important that people go armed with that extradition treaty. It's easily obtainable. You can simply Google it and download it and put that in front of the nose of your member of parliament and urge them to do the right thing and bring pressure. We have to continue to build this pressure to raise awareness about Julian's case, to raise awareness of the fact that it's in all our interest. It's not just about the abuse of one man's human rights. It's in all of our interests that Julian is released, and it's certainly in the interests of a free and plural press in this country. And on that basis, I would urge people to join together in the spirit of solidarity to ensure that we do bring that pressure to bear, and we do get the policymakers to do the right thing and get Julian released and get this case dropped.
Thanks, Chris. And lots of solidarity messages in the chat and elsewhere for you, Chris, and how proud we are of the
Thank you very much indeed. I appreciate that. Thank you.
And I did a little roll call of honour earlier of the wonderful journalists who are supporting Julian or at least covering the case. And I neglected to mention some of the leading lights, including Stefania Maurizi, who's done fantastic work on the Freedom of Information Act, via Freedom of Information Act requests across various jurisdictions, which have really allowed us to see what's really going on in the case. Kevin Gostola, Max Blumenthal, whose fantastic work on the Spanish case has been, we had an event, in fact, a Free the Truth event about it. Aaron Mate, Andrew Fowler, and I'd also like to acknowledge Dean Yates, who was the Reuters Baghdad bureau chief when the two Iraqi Reuters journalists were slaughtered, who has coped with PTSD and trauma to come back and tell his tale and make it clear how things were misrepresented at the time. I'd also like to acknowledge Andrew Fowler, Craig Murray, of course, and John Pilger, and also wanted to acknowledge something you said, Chris, about being an ex-bricklayer. I don't know many I don't know many people who don't recognise how wonderful your work has been. Not just as a working class man who's transcended some of the stereotypes about working class people, but also about being inspiring to the rest of us. And particularly in relation to your work on modern monetary theory and where does money come from, and these kind of big picture issues which are not really discussed. So thank you for doing that. And over to Ian Munro for some final thoughts.
I just give a plug for Stephanie Kelton's book. It's in the background there, a bit of a subliminal sort of publicity. The Deficit Myth, Stephanie Kelton. I'd urge everybody to read it. Excellent book.
Yeah, and Richard Murphy's book on where the
Yes, of course,
the joy of tax. Yes, excellent. Ian, final thoughts.
Thanks, Deepa, and thanks to all the speakers. Absolutely fascinating historical perspective on the relationship between the Julian Assange case and British history, the trade union movement, and of course the links to human rights and so forth. Absolutely fascinating. And what the Assange case is, it's a historical moment. It's absolutely crucial. And some of the issues that have been discussed today are obviously deeply concerning, related to how the process, the extreme measures being taken against Assange, which is also part of a broader treatment of whistleblowers in general. You mentioned a few: John Kiriakou, Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, and so forth, that are treated extremely harshly, smeared, living in exile, tortured, and so forth, for raising issues concerning basic human rights, the democratic functioning of law, war crimes, and things that we should care about in a democratic society. And then there are also these issues related to due process and what's going on there. The United Nations Special Rapporteurs and Human Rights Councils are raising issues with the Swedish government and the British government and the American government regarding the surprisingly high number of incidents of potential judicial misconduct. And also the involvement, of course, of private security firm Stratfor. We're looking at this UC Global case at the moment, and previously HB Gary, where the American government and large financial institutions have been involved in hiring private security firms in order to spy and discredit and circulate misinformation about WikiLeaks and Assange. There's all sorts of nasty things going on, which unfortunately the media have not been doing a very good job, and seem to be largely just hopping on board of the circulation of this propaganda. But I just want to end by supporting very strongly Chris Williamson's recommendation that the people participating in this forum and watching this broadcast lobby their MP to sign the early day motion that's been posted in the chat. And and thanks very much to the speakers.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you for all those months ago helping us set up the Free the Truth event in the first place. I wanted to finally just remind people that there is a model motion posted via the NUJ. I think John Reese's people have done a huge amount of work getting it through various trade unions. Please make sure you, if you're a trade unionist on this call and you can understand the importance of solidarity at this time, that you get your trade union to pass that motion supporting Assange. If you're a local CLP member, maybe get your CLP to pass it, your Momentum branch, your local network of activists. And please join us at these events. We will, please make a contribution if you can to the Committee to Defend Julian Assange, who very kindly sponsored the Zoom for this event. It costs an extortionate amount of money for just 1 month. So we're very grateful to them for their support. We're very grateful to Consortium News and Action for Assange. Andrew at Action for Assange has been doing the technicals for this. So Andrew, specifically to you, thank you very much. And very grateful to our wonderful speakers, Chris Williamson, Jeffrey Robertson, who's not on the call at the moment, but I had to leave it, and we knew that he stayed almost till the end. And the wonderful Helen Mercer, who's written this excellent article and whose work actually inspired this event. So thank you for your work, and thank you to all the activists there, Doctors for Assange, Lawyers for Assange, the people putting together the international jurist work. All huge solidarity to the people at WikiLeaks and at the Courage Foundation from all of us, and to Craig Murray, and even to Jeremy Corbyn, who is going through a very difficult time at the moment. So we wish you all the best, and we look forward to future events. Please join us again. Thank you. Bye-bye. I'm going to end the call now, and I want to apologize to the one person in the chat who's raised their hand, but I couldn't see your question in the Q&A. So I'm sorry we couldn't take your question, but hopefully we'll pick you up at the next event. Thanks, everybody.